Hi everyone. In today's video, we're going to wrap up the Messick approach to validity. And if you'll remember, this is a little bit different than the Cook and Campbell approach. In the Messick approach, we're concerned not just with the validity of the test or the experimental design or things like that. We're also more concerned explicitly with how the test is being used. And the way that Messick conceptualizes validity, it's what he calls the unified typology, which when I think about it is a little grandiose. He says, this is the one and only type of validity with these 6 components, and you should bow to your one and true validity God. That may be overstating it a bit, but he does look at validity a little bit more holistically with these 6 components. Last time we talked about content validity. What we'll walk through in the rest of this video is substantive, structural, generalizability, external validity, and we'll end with consequential validity. So in the previous video, we got through content validity. It's the idea that we can look at, are we really capturing our construct in its entirety? Are we defining the boundaries? Substantive validity is honestly a really kind of abstract and challenging thing. And this is where Messick gets a little bit problematic. There's no surefire process or way to find substantive validity. It's more of a concept and an ideal to strive for rather than something that we necessarily explicitly test. Messick defines substantive validity, rather, as if your measure is consistent with the theoretical rationales you're basing it on, and more so the thought processes or the psychological processes going on. So what Messick says is substantive validity is you give a test, and are you actually tapping the psychological construct and process that you think you're tapping? So what's going on under the hood? What's going on in your head? Is this the construct or is this something else? Are you using domain-specific knowledge or are you bringing in something else you know in order to, say, answer the questions? So an example of violating substantive validity would be that construct-irrelevant easiness we talk about. Maybe you're answering a test not because you know the content super well or that you're smart, although you all, I'm sure, are very smart. You might be answering it because you are a good test taker. You know the strategies for it. So are we able to essentially limit our test or our measure to what it is we say we're looking at? Or are we getting something else thrown in there? Are we using that psychological process we say we're using? So another way to think about this, maybe an easier way to think about this, is the measure truly tapping what's going on in your brain or not? Are you getting at, someone's knowledge of something, or are you getting at, or someone's ability, or are you just getting at their memory, for example? So if you give a test and people are supposed to reason, maybe they've seen it before. So they're not actually psychologically reasoning through the question. It could instead be that they're just like, oh, I've seen this before, here's what to do. So this is really hard to do, right? This is really hard to establish. It's hard enough to get a test that we think measures the construct we're looking at. To know if we're actually tapping that psychological process is extremely challenging. And to be perfectly honest, when you're writing up a methods development paper or a measure development paper, for example, you're not reporting substantive validity necessarily. Think of it more as a consideration about your measure. Do you think this is tapping the thing in someone's head that it's supposed to be? It's because this is an invisible process. We can't observe someone and think, ooh, boy, now they're really getting it. Now they're really using that part of their brain that we want, because we're not mind readers. And I think that's honestly for the best. It would be highly disturbing for everyone if you could read everyone else's mind. Think about that a minute. Like, it sounds like a cool superpower, but probably wouldn't turn out great. We could, however, there are ways that we can try to provide evidence. Remember this idea of building up a case for validity? There's some ways we can try to get at substantive validity for some things. One example would be think aloud protocols, where not only are you providing the answer, but you're providing your thought process as you go through. If the thought process matches up to what the psychological process is, then great, you've got evidence for that. You could use eye tracker data depending on what you're looking at. You could see where someone's eyes go on a screen. When we're measuring things like implicit bias or racism, we can use eye tracker data to try to get at the psychological processes happening, even if people aren't consciously aware of them. Response time data works. Open-ended response times items sometimes work. Self-recall of performance, like what were you thinking about when you did this? Not great. The problem with the really effective things, the think aloud protocols or the eye trackers, is that they're hard to do and they don't work for a great many things. So think aloud protocols, you have to have someone there with the person as they go through it. With eye tracker data, you need more tech, and it doesn't lend itself to necessarily a lot of different things, but it's a consideration. Next up, we have structural validity. This is data providing evidence for the fact that the scoring of the measure is consistent with the structure of the construct. That's a fancy way to say, are you scoring this in a way that matches up to how the construct actually works? Let's take the Beck depression inventory, for example. This is something that's non-typical. It's you rate what you get, but then you sum it. The more score you have, the more depressed you are. It doesn't really make sense as much to average that, because depression is not just an average of how you respond to these things, it's a sum of all these things add up. So in the case of the Beck depression inventory, sure, it has structural validity. The scoring structure, summing those items, works. And if you average them, for instance, it might not. Whereas if I'm measuring something simple like job satisfaction, an average of strongly disagree to strongly agree items works perfectly fine. Job satisfaction is anywhere from satisfied to dissatisfied on a continuum. Averaging it captures that. But remember, when we started our projects, I said, you'll probably use a 1 to 5, 1 to 7 type scale on average, but think about it. And if you want to do something different, that's okay, that's great. You just have to justify it. You have to really think through structural validity. We didn't say those terms at the beginning of the semester, but that's what we're talking about. So you need to have good directions. You need to make sure that test users aggregate or don't aggregate. They average them together or not appropriately. Are you providing an overall score versus item level? Sometimes test users don't need the item level. They don't need to get into the individual item level of responses. That's too specific. There's stages in the development of the construct. Are they representative? How do you combine subscale scores? Right? Are you looking at your dimensions separately, or does it maybe make sense to combine them? For something like the Big Five, it doesn't make sense to combine those 5 different personality scores. But if you're looking at something like, take organizational commitment, it has 3 different dimensions, but they're all similar, or normative, continuance, and affective commitment. You could average those together in a meaningful way. Are you giving subdimension scores? Basically, this one is pretty straightforward. Does your scoring and how you're reporting the scoring, item level, subdimension level, overall, match up with what is actually important about the construct? If you report an overall average, can your construct be represented with an overall average? If you report subdimensions, are those truly separate things that you should be reporting? You want to, again, whatever you end up doing, whatever you think through is fine. You just have to give this consideration. Next, we have generalizability. And this is where it gets kind of confusing. This is what Cook and Campbell called external validity. It's the same thing, just called something different. And in fact, I kind of like this better. External validity for Cook and Campbell is generalizability. So Messick just calls it generalizability. It's the degree to which the measure's properties and interpretations hold across different populations and settings. So from different countries, from different demographic groups, college students to working adults, whatever it may be. Um, so it takes kind of this basic idea, does the test mean the same thing to different people or different settings? But it also adds, do the items cover the whole construct for different groups or in different settings? It's another way to think about this is even zooming out more and saying, is the construct the same? Is the construct of work ethic the same for children and for adults? Probably not. So if you're trying to measure work ethic in those two populations, you might need different tests because those items aren't going to match up to who you're looking at. Similarly, and just to give one more example there, we think about cross-cultural things. Different cultures have different cultural constructs or conceptions that influence how they think. To use kind of a really basic example, the United States is incredibly individualistic. The Far East, Japan, China, Korea, tend to be very collectivistic. We in the United States think of things that I did. I did this, I did this, I did this. In Asia, it's about the group. It's we did this, we did that. And it's not just a linguistic nuance. It is genuinely a difference in how people think. People oftentimes in more collectivistic cultures don't think about the individual. Their first thought is about the group. So if we're looking at conscientiousness or work ethic, for example, our items that measure conscientiousness here in the US may not represent the content domain of conscientiousness elsewhere. So we want to be really careful, not just, can we adapt these scores from one place to another, but even to the degree of, are these items going to work with these different populations? So if the test and the items are relevant and representative across people, that you can give it. You want to, again, it's not necessarily providing evidence for or against this or testing it. You want to think through this. So there's tensions when you're developing a test. You want it to be accessible, but you have to balance depth, how in-depth or how detailed are you getting, breadth of a concept, how broad are you getting, how big is your construct space, and time, how long is this going to take? And if you have unlimited time, you can make a measure that generalizes probably everywhere. But we don't have unlimited time for people to take tests, so you have to balance these things out. One way that we can provide evidence for generalizability is looking at differential item functioning across subpopulations. So using item response theory, we can look to see, does this item function the same for men and for women, or for people from the United States and from Korea? We can examine correlations among items. So we drop items that are highly correlated to one another because it's redundant. And the differential item functioning piece, in the previous video, we talked about detecting bias or subgroup differences. That's differential item functioning as well. And we'll talk about that in the next few videos about really digging in. It's kind of a fun one. This is kind of all high level. We'll dig into specific ways to detect test bias as we finish out the semester. So ultimately, generalizability is, what are the limits that we have in interpreting our scores, right? Does the score stay the same in different situations with different groups? Do the items on one set generalize to the rest of the construct? All these pieces, it's all to say we want to be thoughtful. We want to consider, does this test work for our population? Who was it developed with? And could we use it appropriately with the group of people we have? Don't just assume that it'll work. Think about it. What are some things you have to read through the items, you have to read through the construct definition and think, could there be differences not due to the construct or differences on the construct, but other differences due to being in different groups or different countries or different situations? Next, we have external validity. Now, remember, Cook and Campbell had their external validity that was basically generalizability. Messick has this concept of external validity. It is different. And again, on the test, I will specify which goes to which. External validity for Messick is the degree to which a measure correlates with related constructs. And he calls it external because it's how related constructs, your construct is, to constructs outside or external to it, or other constructs. This is convergent and divergent evidence. We talked about convergent and divergent validity. Those are two things that fall under this umbrella of external validity. It's the degree to which our measure correlates with something it should be correlated with and shows little correlation with something it shouldn't be related to. Remember, we're providing evidence for criterion relevance and contamination when we do this, or lack of contamination, hopefully. And ideally, you're getting evidence from multi-trait, multi-method studies. You're not just using all self-report, you're using maybe an experiment and a survey, and you're looking at different traits. You're looking at the trait you care about for convergent evidence and a different trait for divergent evidence. I gave the stupid example earlier that I'm just going to keep rolling with. So multi-trait, you're looking at conscientiousness and grit, two different traits for convergent, and conscientiousness and belief in unicorns for divergent. And if you look across these different traits, ideally with different ways of collecting the data, you can get evidence for external validity. This is actually one that is nice because you can get correlations that support validity. And that's actually why we're doing that in our projects, because it's easy to collect that statistical evidence. So this just a little bit more MTMM, or multi-trait multi-method matrices. It's basically, like I said, using different traits and different methods. You can put it into a table that shows this validity. You can do that oftentimes these days. People just say, here's our correlation with our convergent measure and our correlation with our divergent measure. The last one that we'll talk about for Messick's validity is consequential validity. And this is, what are the real life consequences of using the scale? What should you be concerned about when you apply this in real life? So what are the social outcomes if you use this test as it's supposed to be designed? What are the potential sources of invalidity, bias, things like that? Basically, what could go wrong? What are the unintended consequences of using this? And I want to point out, this is actually fairly controversial. Some people say scientists shouldn't care about this. Consequential validity doesn't matter. That's on the people using it. And I would personally disagree with that. I think it is up to people that develop tests to think about how they'll be used. If you develop an intelligence test that's good, but you know it has serious differences in racial outcomes, you have to think about that. You have to think about how is this going to disadvantage people? How is this going to prevent opportunities? How is this going to enable idiots to say there's these differences and races should be treated differently? You need to do your due diligence, in my mind, when you create a measure or when you use a measure about what problems could come up. And then you need to address them, either by saying, I think in the case of like intelligence tests, they say, okay, there's these differences, but then they also did the research into, here's the reasons why. It's not differences in intelligence, it's differences in socioeconomic status and opportunity and so on and so forth. But it is controversial. So just know that not everyone agrees that we should consider this. So other unintended consequences, subpopulation differences, monetary differences. Will this give people more or less opportunity and money? And what, think in the short term and the long term. But the argument here is that test developers should collect data about how the test is being used in outcomes. You shouldn't just say, here's a test, it's reliable, we think it's valid, go use it. You should see how it's being used. The GRE, for all of its problems, does this. They collect, application data for graduate school, and they try to get, who's admitted and who's not, so they see how the test is being used. So obviously the biggest issue is bias towards subpopulations, oftentimes towards racial groups for intelligence tests. That's the most common, but well, that's the easy kind of example to give. I want to be clear that it's not the only example. And you want to think about, does this test accidentally disadvantage some group? I think I can think of any minority group, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, religion, where some tests could show differences between those groups in ways that it's going to cause problems. So bias or systematic differences isn't necessarily bad. Sometimes tests have differences. How you use it, how you use the test matters. So the take-home point for consequential validity, like a lot of these others, isn't so much test this, it's think about it. Collect data on outcomes, follow up, see how the test is being used, and then be willing to do more work to refine a test. Or if you're not developing tests, but you're using tests, be willing to be careful about the conclusions you make, couch those conclusions. Find a different test. If you're using a test that is biasing against a certain group and you're diagnosing ADHD or depression or whatnot, and you're getting bias, get a different test. Contact the test developers, show them this is what our data says. And if they're any good, they'll give a response. But this isn't, so I guess this isn't just test developers, this is test users, which will be a lot of you at some point. Keep track of this stuff, think about this stuff. Just because someone's developed a test doesn't mean it's good. You have a responsibility to think about the usage of the tests that you give out. And Messick, more so than I'd say Cook and Campbell, gives you this good list of things to think about. You can't necessarily do anything about them for a test, but think about it, decide if that test is something you want to use, or if there's a way to improve how you're using it or interpreting it. So to sum it all up, interpretations of test scores should have it should be relevant. You should hit the construct. You should combine them appropriately, unidimensional, multidimensional. You should aggregate them. You can get some pieces of evidence like convergent and divergent validity. But the big take home here is think about why people might respond differently on this test for reasons that are not whatever test it is you're giving. Think about why people might respond differently for reasons that are not related to that construct. Why might one person respond differently to a test measuring depression than another person that's unrelated to how depressed they are? Think about how you can generalizable the tests are. Is this appropriate if you go work somewhere else with a different population? And then think about the consequences. If you use a test or develop a test and you give a score, how is that going to be used? And that really is kind of up to all of us to, take professional responsibility for making sure tests are being used in the manner we intend and not beyond. So that was a little soapboxy. We're going to get in the next and last set of videos actually into test bias and differential item functioning. That's going to be, okay, how do we detect bias? So we've talked about how it's an issue. We'll talk about how do we figure out if it's actually a problem statistically. But these 2 slide decks for validity are just meant to say, here's 2 different ways to think about validity. Please carefully consider them. And neither one is better or worse. They just work and take different ways. They take different perspectives on things. And I wanted to make sure that you know both. So when someone starts ranting about validity, you can have a greater well of knowledge to draw upon. So that's it for this one, folks. I will talk to you next time about test bias.